So welcome back, everybody. I hope you've had the opportunity to get to know somebody new in the virtual domain. And I'm very, very pleased to introduce our next two speakers. And it's very nice to see two actual human beings instead of people in a virtual chat. As you can see, the smiles coming up live and perfectly on cue. I'd like to introduce, first of all, Natasha from Grab. She's the head of employee engagement, diversity, inclusion from Grab. Very, very well-known organization to all of us in the region as we struggle to get our journeys to and fro work. And joining Natasha and running the session will be Hardeep. Hardeep is from Veldhoen, again, probably known to many of you as a strategy consultant in the region. Hardeep is the head of Asia. And these guys are going to be talking a little bit about how do we emerge more strongly out of this challenging situation by thinking in a very, very human-centric mode. I won't spend any more time giving an introduction. These two will be more than capable of doing that better than I. So Hardeep and Natasha, over to you, and everyone enjoy the session.
Thanks, Neil. And thanks for the organizers for WORKTECH. I'm really, really happy to be here. Of course, as you can see here, there's two of us presenting. Neil's already mentioned it. The flow will be that I will start. I'll talk about some of the, let's call it the theory, some of the thinking behind it. And then Natasha, who has been with Grab for a period of time now, has been doing a wonderful job putting a lot of what I'll be talking about into practice. So she'll be able to share a little bit about that with you as well. Natasha, want to say something real quick before we go into it?
No, I'm just super excited to be here right now. Thank you, Hardeep, for inviting me as well.
Cool. Thanks, Tash. So I will get into it. So you'll see Tash in a short while. Okay, so I'll get right into my material now. So as was mentioned by Neil, today we'll be talking about how to emerge stronger from disruption. Of course, in the context of here, disruption is the pandemic. And how do we do that through using human-centric innovation? So this is a joint presentation, both myself and Natasha. So this is both the theory and, as I was saying, the practical experience. So hopefully we can share some things with you that you can all take away as some tips and some points that you can all implement in your own organizations. A little bit very briefly about Veldhoen. For those of you that don't know, we are a global organization, as Neil mentioned, Workstyle strategists. So we're in a number of different geographies in Europe, in the US, as well as here in Asia. We've got our regional HQ in Singapore, but we're also present in Australia and Japan as well. Our mission, and this is kind of as the spirit of today, is really about creating a better world of work. We've gone through a lot over the past 18 months or so. And so from a work perspective, things have definitely been challenging. It's really our mission and our goal to be able to actually create a better world of it, regardless of what that looks like in practice. So in a hybrid environment, we're still here to create that better world of work, and that will make sense as I walk you through some of our thinking behind this. We've done around 300 or so transformation projects globally in terms of change. So we're very used to this in terms of changing in the face of developments in the work environment. But of course, the last 18 months has been somewhat unprecedented, but we have been navigating through with a number of clients, Grab included as well. So in terms of what I'll be talking about, the pandemic, in terms of how it's come along, it's disrupted not just the workplace. Of course, workplace is what a lot of us tend to think of when we think of work, but actually fundamentally the way we work. It isn't about the workplace. In fact, it never really was. It's really this point about the way we work. And that's what I really want to focus on this morning. In terms of what this disruption has actually caused in terms of challenges, I just want to kind of lay out a very, very simple model that we have in place for this. If you look at this spectrum here in terms of distance in time and space, in terms of how teams operate, how employees work, you've got on your left-hand side the very little space. In the right-hand side, there's a lot of time and distance between employees, between teams. In the old days, call it traditional type of setup, there was very little of time and space difference between employees and teams because we were all physically working in the same space and at the same time. As we went into the earlier part of the COVID period and the pandemic in general, we had what we would call kind of a fully virtual team. There were periods of time when there was no office to go to. And so people were literally having to work from their home environments or wherever their other environment is So there was a huge amount of distance in time and space between teams. I'd say today we're somewhere in between. Again, depending on geography you're in or depending on your organization in terms of policy, you could be somewhere to the right or left of it, but you're generally going to be in between these two extremes. So what is this sort of created? What has this challenged teams for as a result of the disruption? As we see it, it's four main buckets. The first one is about maintaining team connection. This is one thing that I think many of us can relate to, but if you're no longer in a position where you're physically with your team members, how do you maintain that feeling of team? How do you feel connected to your team members despite that distance? It's a challenge. Meaningful collaboration. How do you meaningfully collaborate? How do you create those opportunities to collaborate with your colleagues, to collaborate with people in teams outside of yours when the actual interaction you have is quite sparse and very targeted, very much a lot of Zoom calls or a lot of Teams calls, which are about specific agendas? How do you collaborate outside of that if you wanted to? Again, challenging. Decision-making, and the context of decision-making is about making the right types of decisions, but also in a timely manner. If you're no longer physically in the same space, you can't rely on being able to do things incidentally and doing things when it suits you. Sometimes it has to be a lot more intentional, tricky type of thing to take place in a hybrid environment. And finally, intentional and incidental knowledge sharing. So how do you make knowledge sharing work in a hybrid environment? When people aren't all in the same space, you can't do what we might call our traditional types of learning and development interventions. Or if you do, you have to do them in a very different way. You need to be able to have the right technology and the right space to be able to make that work. Again, be it physical space in an office or in the home environment. A lot of that needs to be quite carefully thought through. And I think all of us, again, I'd be kind of remiss not to mention that there may be different levels of this to different teams, but I would say that in general, all teams, all organizations will have faced some of these challenges at the very least as we've transitioned to our new ways of working. So in terms of what an effective work environment needs to take into consideration, there are three main pillars. First of all, physical environment. Of course, I mentioned it isn't about the workplace and it isn't solely about, but of course the workplace makes a difference. And again, today's workplace is no longer just the office environment. The workplace is the home, it's the office, and it could be some other form of other. Again, depending on people's circumstances, we have different ways and ways in which we actually perform our roles now compared to before. Virtual environment, so the tech infrastructure, both from a hardware perspective, from a software perspective. I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail on both of these two for today. What I want to talk about and focus on this morning is the behavioral environment. So the behaviors are things like the culture of an organization, the norms that you have in place, and just the general ways of working that you have instilled within your own organization. And the behavioral part is what I'll be talking about today. And Tash will also be sharing that element as well, given her space is much more about engagement. So we're going to be talking about those points this morning. So in terms of the behavioral elements that are needed to ensure a successful hybrid work environment, again, the way we see it is that we see three main buckets. Again, these are informed. This is leadership capabilities, rhythms and rituals, as well as hybrid meetings. Again, hybrid meetings is a big topic, but it's generally the norms and the ways in which that you run a hybrid meeting. It's one of the things that's changed the most as a result of this shift towards hybrid. This is all informed by a lot of survey work that we've done across the region, including Australia, out here in Singapore as well, where we've looked at how leaders and organizations perceive this hybrid work style and what's needed to make it successful. There's actually a white paper that we've produced on that, which I will later on in the chat link to. So if you feel curious and you want to have a look at that, please do. It's very informative. But in terms of these three buckets, I'm going to go through them in the course of this morning as well. So first of all, from a leadership perspective, the way we see it is that there are three super crucial cultural traits that are needed to make a hybrid work environment work effectively. Number one, trust. Trust is obviously, I think many of us can relate to this. Trust has always been important in a hybrid work environment when you're no longer physically in the same space as other people or always seeing people within your teams. Without trust, it's very difficult to overcome that distance. Trust is there, which actually enables you to place a greater amount of reliance on and have hopefully a positive expectation of your colleagues, of your employees, So without trust, it's very difficult to make that happen. It will otherwise lead to a lot of second guessing, a lot of anxiety from a leader's perspective. Trust is absolutely needed and crucial to be able to make hybrid work. Clarity, in some ways, comes hand in hand with trust. But the point about having clarity is that without it, you're actually going to deal with a lot of complexity in an organization. If you have a role which you're not clear about in terms of how you're measured, in terms of what your roles, your responsibilities are, it's very difficult for you to perform. And it will make that feeling or that sense of team, that sense of actually being part of an organization will very, very quickly diminish. So you do need clarity, and it's something that needs to be built on by leaders and by organizations in a hybrid environment. And then finally, outcome focus. Actually being able to build in practices and approaches in an organization that focus on the outcome rather than focus on how you get there, which again, in many of us maybe will have related to, if we're talking a couple of decades ago in terms of work, there was sometimes an element of less focus on the outcome, but more about how you get there. So it was often presenteeism might have been seen in an office environment in the past, where if you're seeing someone physically around you, you're assumed they're working, but actually maybe they're not working. And it was never really important. In today's age, because you can't always see someone, it's much more about defining where you want somebody to get to and measuring them on that. So being focused on the outcome, not how you get there. So what can be done in terms of actually getting towards this? There's a huge amounts of things that you can do, and I'm not going to be able to be exhaustive about it, but some of the things that we've seen can be meaningful that actually build out these three traits. Leaders acknowledging disruption and defining the direction that they're aiming for. Actually being able as a leader to be able to put your hand up and say, this is all happening around us. I've got an idea of where I want to go to, but being very open and being vulnerable about that as a leader is super crucial to build out that element of trust within teams. Having clear, tangible, and objective terms when you're defining things like goals or you're defining outcomes. Again, touching on that point before about clarity and outcome focused, if things aren't clear or if things are not set in terms of where you need to get to as a team member, it's very difficult for you to perform your role effectively. And even more so in a hybrid environment where you could essentially go many different directions in terms of how you get somewhere. So it's very important that you're clear and very tangible about what you need people to deliver for you to function in your business. Being open in communication. So actually being willing to keep employees informed. Again, to whatever extent that it means in your organization, but doing more of the comms than you may have been used to. And Tash is going to mention that when she talks about it from a grad perspective, but comms in that perspective are hugely important as we're having to navigate through disruption and through a lot of change as well. This point about empowering teams as well, we talked before about, or rather I mentioned before about the objective terms that you might put in place, but it's also important for a team in itself to actually define what the role and responsibilities are amongst themselves. So teams themselves, rather than it being very top down and very much defined at a very senior level, it's really about the team to actually problem solve as they go along, for them to actually define how they will contribute, how they will actually take on responsibilities to drive to the goals that have been set for them as a team. And it's something that we see works extremely effectively if you're able to empower teams to do that well and do it for themselves. One point, a very tangible point that I really like is the idea of leaders actually being willing to and opening up to having Ask Me Anything sessions. There's a huge amount of anxiety that can go along as we're facing disruption. I think many of us can probably relate to that in the context of the last 18 months or so. But organizations that we work with, leaders take the initiative to actually host these Ask Me Anything sessions, whereby people are able to articulate what's at the top of their mind, what they need answers on, and then the leaders can actually show what their perspective on it might be. And sometimes if they don't know the answer, they can be open and honest about it. It really builds that level of trust in the organization. And then also this final point as well, of course, while we're working in a hybrid environment, yes, we will sometimes not be physically together. Sometimes we can be. And it's very important for teams to align on when they might be able to physically connect with each other. That physical connection is not something that we should lose sight of. It is important, but it's also important more than that is that teams that make the effort to align on that. It's a hugely important practice. And I think it's something that really helps to build out that level of trust in teams if they can rely upon that as well going forwards. Rhythms and rituals. So the other point that I'd mentioned on the previous slide, super crucial in terms of actually ensuring business practices are not just suitable for the organization, but they're also consistent. So how is it that you build in some levels of agreements about people, etiquettes in place that actually address the ways that you work and keep that consistent? Some of the key buckets in terms of how we perceive this, and we've seen in practice, are hugely important. First of all, social. What are the norms that you have in place that allow for your team to maintain social ties? Important to think about that. And it'll be very different for different organizations. In some organizations, it might be that people make time for Zoom check-ins on a frequent basis, or they have Zoom events together as teams. In other situations, it might not be. It might be that they focus on the physical side, but they're actually very intentional about how they make the physical connection work and how they maintain it. Workflow norms. So how does the team actually work in terms of completing their tasks if they're working flexibly? So again, it's about having structure in workflow. There's got to be some levels of teams connecting about what works for them to be able to drive to the outcome that they need to. So having those norms in place where people can rely upon it ensures that the team can work effectively and efficiently to actually drive towards its goals. Hybrid meetings. So we touched on this as well before, but how do you run a meeting effectively in a hybrid environment? Of course, if we're no longer all physically in the same place, we might have situations where some of us are physically in the same place and other people are not, or we might have fully virtual meetings. And in all of those cases, there need to be some norms, some behaviors that people can rely upon. And again, depending on the team, that's going to be very different. In some cases, it might be all cameras on if you're virtual. It might be that you don't have to. There could be things like that in some ways, having those types of things articulated and clearly agreed amongst teams really enables that people can experience things in a consistent manner and they'll know what to expect from each other. It's very, very important again, given that hybrid meetings is something that's changed more than anything else, possibly as a result of this shift towards hybrid working. And then finally, inclusive practices. I think the shift towards hybrid working has highlighted the importance of inclusion, as well as the differences in diversity that we experience more than anything, because we all have different ways in which we work, and it becomes more and more apparent when you're no longer in the same space. So it's very important as well that you have norms that are while you have everything in place as those other three buckets, it's also got to be an element of actually inclusion. How do you make people feel included, and what norms are there that can allow people to choose how they themselves want to work in that environment? Again, this element of being inclusive is hugely important, and I think most of us can relate to the fact that this has become a sharper focus as time's gone on as well. So in terms of what does this mean for organizations in practice, I'm going to just summarize with a few points before I pass over to Natasha. But for what we've seen, hugely, hugely important steps that need to be taken for organizations, that leaders really do need to create their vision. And not just create that vision in a very top-down manner, but actually empower employees to be able to get there. It isn't something as well that there's a one-size-fits-all in terms of actually getting employees where the organization needs to get to. Balance needs to be found at both an organization and team level. It will be different in different teams. It will be different by different employee types. It's very important that that diversity is celebrated and accounted for. And then finally as well, when it comes to actually handling this change, it's not that it should be committed to at any level except for at the full top level, at the organization level. Leaders need to be able to embody, role model, and actually drive through this change, because it's really how people will be looking for inspiration as they're dealing with a lot of challenge as well. So those are the 3 points from my side. Those are the key takeaways I'd love to leave with you guys. I will otherwise move on to Natasha, who will be sharing with you the real life experience of a real life organization. So Natasha, take it away.
Very cool. Thank you so much, Hardeep. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here to present to you today Grab's secret sauce, Workplace Hybrid 2.0. Hardeep, it's been such a pleasure to watch and also learn from you in the past year. We were only meant to work months together, but I guess the pandemic sort of extended our friendship a little bit more. And I'm just so happy to be here to tell you guys a little bit about what we're doing in our organization and maybe some tips and tricks that perhaps you can take along with yours as well. So as an introduction, my name is Natasha. I'm the head of employee engagement and diversity inclusion at Grab. My role is a simple one to explain, but really hard to do. My role is actually to make sure that Grabbers, what we call our internal staff, are excited to come to work every day, and also proud of the work that they do. When the pandemic sort of hit, our role and our team specifically, especially within the people organization, our role was to adapt, right? And do it quickly. Now, as we move to an endemic stage, we've noticed that some habits that we cultivated during the pandemic is actually worth cultivating. So similarly to Hardeep's presentation about trust, clarity, and being outcome-driven, at Grab, these 4 main themes are our anchor as we move through these phases and create long-lasting organizational-wide habits as well. Next. So these are our 4 main pillars. We believe that we should care and communicate, do this much, much more than you think you need to. We believe that you need to empower your teams more than you are comfortable with. We believe we need to identify unspoken needs. We're talking pulse checks, ask, analyze, don't assume you know what everybody's needs are. And the most important thing is that we believe you should always anchor on purpose. So remember the power of purpose and refocus on the core mission all the time. So we'll go through our first pillar that is around care and communication. And when the pandemic first hit us, we were super blindsided. Nobody expected it. Fake news, information overload, it was just everywhere. And we needed to act fast and care and communicate more than we think we needed to. So we needed to have that clarity in our communication and also think about wellness beyond just information giving. So like everyone else, we started with emails. But what we noticed was Grabbers were not reading them at all. They were just getting lost in all these barrage of emails that are coming through. So we had to be creative. And this is actually an array of creativity in this slide right now. And we experimented with different approaches. So here you can see that we even branded Grabber Care Communications at #1 there, where we threw in some infographics that were a lot more eye-catching. We even created a little avatar for our head of people there as well. So it's really identifiable. We consolidated all the country's information onto one site, which is at #3 here, where is really a space for one source of truth, for example. One thing that we did to launch, one thing that we did was super innovative was actually we launched a radio station in the office, and which was more lively in terms of content. So we played music, we got a lot of song dedications and dedications towards each other, which is really cool, whilst of course slipping in some very, very important announcement as well, such as like office closures and things like that. So we know they're listening. I'm glad to say, what is still around right now, our Grabber Care Comms has actually evolved to Grabber Growth and Wellbeing, which Grabbers actually look very much to, hearing from our head of people. And I'm also happy to say that our radio station is alive and well as well. Next. During the pandemic, we started coaching on demand to help actually support our managers. So our people managers were able to sort of tap into an extensive network, and this helped empower our managers more than they were comfortable with. Some examples include how do we start decentralizing decision-making, for example, so as to not create a bottleneck, right? And ensure that people managers are well-equipped to talk about context setting and things like that. We also, we looked into approval rights, right? And approval rights that has to be distributed, but we coached them in a way whereby it had to be fast, but guardrails had to come up really, really quickly. So to this day, coaching is a huge part of Grab's culture. We have an internal bot now that connects Grabbers to coaches and mentors on topics that Grabbers would love to get coached on. And this could be anything from well-being to diversity inclusion, through even our employee resource groups as well. Again, completely organic, but the appetite to receive coaching is absolutely there, even now. Next. So our third theme is for us to really identify unspoken needs, right? So we're talking about asking grabbers, analyzing, don't assume that you know what everyone needs. There's a really, really good article from Microsoft, studying their own remote workforce. And let me just show you some stats that could be interesting for you to think about as you think about changes in habits and therefore needs of the organization as well. Next. So as you can see here, this is really, really, really surprising. There's obviously these numbers are not shocking to anyone. We know these numbers. We've been in a pandemic for the last 18 months. But in the recent decades, what we've noticed is that meetings are generally getting longer. And the research shows that obviously it has a very, very big negative impact on our employee productivity and also happiness. So our flip to shorter meetings came actually pretty organically. We didn't have a management mandate to say, hey, you got to shorten your meetings. And according to our survey sentiments, the change was actually really, really appreciated. Suddenly, this whole specter of an hour-long meeting seemed to demand more scrutiny. Things like, does this meeting need to be this long? Is this a wise use of everyone's time? So this is one of many ways that the remote work period have actually a longer-term impact. Next up, we also saw senior managers collaborating, and 8 hours plus more per week, which was fantastic. Managers were sending 115% more IMs. We saw, there were 50% more increase in individual contributors in terms of how they communicated. We use a platform called Slack, and what we noticed was that most employees maintained their existing networks, but what was more encouraging was that people's network size actually grew. And with this vibrancy of communication, and we have all this data that is behind the scenes, we noticed that the number of meetings increased tremendously. And using this data, unspoken needs again, everybody, we introduced something called No Meeting Wednesdays at Grab, which again is greatly appreciated, was never asked, but through unspoken needs, we were able to identify Zoom fatigue before it became a fatigue. So that's a long-lasting habit that we're gonna have. Next, I wanted to share this beautiful quote with everybody. A good organizational purpose calls for a pursuit for greatness in service of others. I'm going to drop some crazy stats on everybody right now. The average person works 1,842 hours a year. That adds up to about 92,100 hours over a 50-year career. That's a long time, right? And during those hours, sometimes it's easy to forget why we do what we do. And when things are super unclear and there's a period of confusion, just like the pandemic, it is often followed by a lot of reflection on purpose and meaning. So next slide. So onto our fourth pillar, anchoring on our purpose. So as what Hardeep mentioned before, in building trust, clarity, and becoming super outcome driven, it's important to anchor on purpose. It's important to show this every single day in our everyday habits, in how we make decisions, in how we treat one another. Here, I'm happy to share is Grab's vision that Grabbers anchor on, where we create economic opportunities at scale. We create financial inclusion for those that are underserved or unbanked, and we are enabling safe access on our platforms. Next. So I'd love for you to think about this, and I'd love for you to think about which resonates with you and your team today. It might be some, it might be all, it might be none. Next. But one key takeaway is do as much as you can for your people. Care and communicate more than we think we need to. Empower your team more than they're super comfortable with. Listen more to unspoken needs. And anchor more and more on purpose. Because honestly, you never know what might just stick to your new ways of working. Thank you. That's it.
Yeah, thanks, Tash. I guess we're finished up on our side here. So Neil, I'll pass it back to you. I believe that you'll be helping us with moving into Q&A. So thanks so much, everyone, for listening and being here with us.
Absolutely. So that gets us off to a racing start. Thanks to both of you for getting us going. Terrific. I have some comments, or rather a question for both of you. Hardeep, let's just go back to you. One thing that struck me as you were talking about how we work and the kind of suggestions and recommendations you were making to improve, it suddenly struck me that actually this was true before the pandemic. Actually, what you were describing there was just simply good practice in how to work better. And it's interesting, isn't it, that a difficult time has maybe allowed us to, I don't want to use the reset word, but I will, just to reset and think again about what we're doing. Do you want to elaborate a little bit around that point? I didn't notice my own question mark at the end there. Forgive me for that.
Thanks, Neil. No, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. In fact, I have a version of my presentation before this actually had that nothing's really changed actually in reality.
Okay.
And the reality is I think more than anything is that it's put into focus the areas that are important, the areas that we do need to focus on, because I do think that we perhaps took for granted the fact that we could use, in some ways, being in a physical space with other people in the past had it was a bit of a cheat code in a way. It was almost like we could get away with things because we had that to rely on. But now that we're a lot more slightly adrift, as it were, I think it's forced us to be more conscious and more intentional about the way that we work as teams. And I think in some ways, like you said, I think Neil earlier says, I think there's some good that's come of it in that sense. The good thing, I think, is that it's forced us to look at these things more closely. And as organizations become a lot sharper about the way that we work together as teams. And I think more than anything is that because we're much more conscious, like you said, Neil, we're hopefully addressing problems we've been dealing with for much, much longer. So I totally agree with you, and aligns very well with how we see it.
No, absolutely. It's really interesting. Tash, if I may describe you as Tash, I was terribly formal at the beginning, but you came up with some quite interesting things there. I really like this idea of communicating more than you're comfortable with. To begin my question, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Communication in an Asian context where very often, speaking very generally, communication tends to be a command and control mode, doesn't it? It's authoritarian. It's things coming down from upon high. You're describing a mode of communication which is the opposite of that, and it's about engagement. What did you do to help your probably middle managers get over the line and understand how things can be done more effectively?
Thanks for your question. I think we don't have the silver bullet here, everyone. So whatever that we're doing is obviously we're experimenting as we go. There is no right answer. I think at the end of the day for us is really coaching them and empowering them to communicate with clarity. So there are three things that we normally do in the communications team is that we communicate on culture, we communicate with clarity, and we communicate with connection. So these are the main three things that in whatever communication platforms we have to hit these three C's. And that for us gives us a sense of a template that then resonates with the rest of the organization. And that's just a little cheat code that everybody can try today.
I think that makes a lot of sense because, one thing you were describing as, communicate more than you think you should or feel comfortable doing. There's always the worry, and I hear this a lot as a practitioner as well. Oh, no, not another survey. No one's going to respond. But that's actually because the way that we've been communicating is boring. It doesn't have purpose. It doesn't have intention. And what you're describing is something else, which helps us to encourage engagement because it might look interesting. And particularly if you feel that your questions and requests are actually being acted upon. Those are the kinds of things that I think make the difference.
Absolutely. I mean, when we were thinking about putting the radio station together, it happened over a weekend. We noticed that grabbers just weren't reading their emails anymore because it was just a barrage of it. And we thought, how do we then connect with them in a way whereby it's easy listening, it's incredibly engaging, they can be a part of the conversation as well. And that was it sparked this idea, and that was kind of how we did it. And it's been very, very well received. And we've seen this really strengthened connection throughout the different countries actually as well.
No, I'm sure you have. We have a question from the audience from Jess Carr. Jess, hi, it's nice to hear from you. And Jess's question is, do you find that people's level of self-awareness affects people's ability to decide how and where they should be working? Question to both of you there, if you want to provide an input.
I'll let Hardeep start.
It's a tough one.
Nice.
It's a tough one. I would say that my broad answer to that do we find that's the case would be, I would say broadly yes. That level of self-awareness is something that it's quite palpable in a way when you're working with organizations where that level of self-awareness or that let's say that lack of trust is present, where people are not willing to explore kind of how they could work effectively or they should work, because there's that level of not just self-awareness but also not looking to be curious about how other people it may land with them as well. From what I see, that with those environments, it's quite a challenge for them to actually effectively work, not just effectively work in a hybrid way, but actually even pre all of that, it would have been challenging in those organizations before too. So I think, yes, absolutely, that level of self-awareness is quite critical for people to take a step back and say, how is what's going on around me landing with me today? And something that Tash mentioned, and I know a lot of organizations aside from Grab are doing these elements of adding in things like coaching, having elements where people can ask for and receive help when they need it. It helps build up that level of self-awareness, and that really does help people navigate these changes and this disruption together. But Jessica,
self-awareness. Sorry.
Yeah,
and the self-awareness needs to apply to managers and leaders as well as staff. Absolutely. This is not the top-down thing. This is everybody. We're all in this together, and we're all having to navigate this new journey. And it is new for many, and not without its challenges. So, well, I'm afraid we have to draw the session to a close. Time is not our greatest friend. Tash, is there anything you wanted to add to the last question before we close off? Or
yeah, just a really quick one. Feedback is a huge part of our organization's culture as well. We have a lot of different programs that ensure that it's a robust one. So, for example, we even have a program that's called Anytime Feedback, whereby you can kind of give each other feedback as we go, and it's totally transparent, so both sides are clear about that. But the really interesting thing that we're doing at the moment is called reverse mentoring. So it's something to look at as well, whereby people, your team's actually telling you a little bit about your self-awareness check. Yeah. So it's really fun.
Like to be looking at the transcripts of those conversations. But no, seriously, that's a really, really important dimension. So, well, I think on behalf of the audience and certainly myself, thank you both very much for an engaging and really, really dynamic start to the day. We appreciate you both joining us and sharing the things that you've described. Thank you both very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks.
Of the conference yourselves.